Welcome to Hope Natural Health, the podcast inspiring you to be your best version. Join me, your host, Dr. Erin, naturopathic doctor, dog mom, cancer survivor, and girl boss weekly as we discuss all things health, hormones, and happiness with a little side of this thing called life. Welcome back to the Hope Natural Health podcast, where I try to get you healthy the right way. Last week's episode, I had a special guest on here, Bo Bissett, and we talked about Amoni. If you are wondering what in the heck that is, I highly recommend going back and listening to that episode. It's amazing. This week, we're going to flip the switch. We're going to talk more about menstrual health and really focus on ovulation and why ovulation is so important. So basically, you either ovulate or you don't. There's no in between. It's either you do or you don't. And the process of ovulation is when a mature egg is released from one of our ovaries. So once that happens, the egg is released. The egg then moves down the fallopian tube, where it literally chills for about 12 to 24 hours and can be fertilized at that time. So if you are planning on having a baby and you have intercourse, sperm is viable in the female reproductive tract for up to 5 days. Remember, the egg is only viable for maybe up to 24 hours. So there's really only that window of about 5 to 6 days that you can actually get pregnant. So keep that in mind. And this is where we have to make sure that ovulation does happen. So like I said, if you either ovulate or you don't. And on a typical 28-day cycle, it's usually around day 14 through 16 of your cycle. Now, apps are very, very popular, and I love apps to track your cycle, and they will give you estimates about when you should be ovulating. But we really want to track different methods of ovulation other than just assuming that we're ovulating when our app tells us, because we might not be ovulating, or maybe you're a late ovulator, or maybe your cycle's a little bit longer and this app isn't 100% correct. So why ovulation is important is, well, it produces progesterone, and progesterone is really what drives our menstrual cycle. It keeps our endometrial lining really, really thick, so that if we were to have implantation with sperm, this is then the fetus is created. This is kind of essentially where the little baby likes to hang out and grow. If we don't, we're essentially shedding out our endometrial lining every single month. So there are a few causes of anovulation, or the inability to ovulate. It could be due to a condition called PCOS. I have a podcast episode on PCOS, so I would recommend going back and listen to that. But PCOS can cause anovulation, or not ovulating. PCOS is polycystic ovarian syndrome. We might have high prolactin levels. Prolactin is another hormone that is really only supposed to be elevated during lactation or breastfeeding. Other than that, it should not be elevated. But higher prolactin levels, which are stimulated from our pituitary, can cause the inability for us to ovulate. We also might be under-eating or overeating. My next episode, we will be talking about a good example of this with Felicia Romero, so stay tuned for that. She was under-eating and overtraining when she was in her fitness world and lost her period for a year and a half. So I see that commonly in a lot of younger athletes, gymnasts, like these women are very lean, and they might lose their period. So if you're losing your period, you're definitely not ovulating. You might also have stopped birth control. This can cause anovulation as well, because if you're on oral birth control, the pill cuts off the communication between your brain and your ovaries to really do anything. So you're not going to ovulate. So how I recommend that we track for ovulation, there's various methods. There's lots of tools out there for you, but you have to find what's going to work for you. But I recommend two things. One, we need to track our basal body temperature. And I don't think tracking basal body temperature is the only way to do it, because there's factors that can influence your basal body temperature and might give you a false elevation in your temperature that you might suspect that you're ovulating when you're not. So things that can influence our temperature, basal body temperature, are perhaps we're maybe feeling a little bit under the weather. Maybe we're hungover. We overindulged the night before. Maybe your sleep was off that night. You had too little sleep or maybe too much sleep. Maybe we're in perimenopause or menopause. This can raise the temperature. Or perhaps your thyroid is having a role in your temperature. So it's not really a good standalone measure in ovulation. But I like to do it because it gives us a good indicator, or it can be a good indicator along with other things to do, like checking your cervical mucus, which we'll talk about in a second. But back to the basal body temperature, like before ovulation, our temperature rises, it's about 97 degrees to 97.5 degrees. So when you want to track your basal body temperature, it's literally first thing when you wake up. You have your thermometer by your nightstand, you take your temperature, and you move on with your day. So it can be a little bit time consuming depending on how, quick your thermometer is. There are some apps that can do that for you, or programs. I believe the Daisy is a basal body temperature tracker. And there's a couple other ones out there that can, you can buy the device and it'll link up to your phone and track it for you. And then after we ovulate, your temperature is roughly around 97.6 to 98.6. So it's going to raise about a whole point-ish above where our temperature is before we ovulated. So the reason you do this is you can see that spike, that tiny spike in your temperature, which might indicate that you ovulated. And then you've got about 24 hours to perhaps create a baby. The other way, or the other thing I like to do in conjunction with the basal body temperature, is check your cervical mucus. So when we ovulate, we are going to produce more mucus, and this is to have the sperm easily transported to find the egg. So that's the mechanism of why we have the increased cervical mucus, or discharge is what a lot of people or say that this happens, but it should be like consistency of like egg whites. This is kind of what the cervical mucus looks like. And you can check that and see if you're ovulating. Most women can report that they have an increased discharge, or, maybe more wet feeling. Like this is likely signs that you did ovulate. So I like doing those two things in conjunction, but more importantly, we have to go back to the basics and really just track the cycle, because you can see when, you can sometimes feel, some women don't feel ovulation, but some women do. And I sometimes do and I sometimes don't. So I wonder if I did ovulate or if I didn't ovulate, because again, you either ovulate or you don't. There's other devices like the keg, which I have, that you insert vaginally every morning, and it tests your temperature and your cervical mucus thickness. So that's kind of a cool device. I'll have some of these linked in the show notes so you can check them out. But a lot of women don't know if they ovulate or when they ovulate. So that's the point of this podcast, is to really provide a little bit of education around the ovulation time. Your ovulation time is also a really good time to get out there and be social, be active, maybe ask for that raise, because estrogen and testosterone are at their highest during this time of your cycle. You might also notice maybe you don't feel as good as you should around this time. You might have like secondary PMS symptoms, which mean that we already have an overabundance of estrogen, and now this is just adding more fuel to the fire. So there's lots of things that, can play a role in the ovulation. So we won't know what's going on unless we test, or you track and you use various methods to really see if we are ovulating. So I hope you learned something during this episode, and I look forward to seeing you again next week.